Welcome to the spring weed identification video. This is part one, where we'll look at a bunch of different characteristics to help you identify weeds. In part two, there will be a quiz, an opportunity to take all of this information and put it to good use. I'm Tammy Jones, the weed specialist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. So the characteristics that we'll be focusing on today will be the cotyledons, the true leaves, and the vegetative structures. Certainly the flowers and the seeds can help us with differentiation, but for the most part, we'll just focus on those early growth stage type of characteristics. And that'll include the shape of the leaf, what the margins look like, some of the vein patterns, the leaf structure, whether it's a simple leaf or whether there's multiple leaflets making a compound leaf. And the arrangement of those leaves, whether there might be hairs on the leaves or other plant parts, the life cycle can help us as well, and the growth habit, and then certain rooting systems, rhizomes or underground stems, and other underground structures can also be used for our identification. The first thing that becomes very obvious when you're looking at identifying weeds is whether it's a monocot or a dicot. If you can see the cotyledons, one cotyledon is a monocot, dicots are two cotyledons. Now typically monocots are grassy weeds, but we also have sedges. We won't look at sedges in this video, but a key for sedges is that sedges have edges. They're usually a triangular stem, and that is an easy identification there. There are a vast array of dicot species that are weeds, so we'll take a deeper dive into those dicots later in the video. For grassy weed identification, we're looking at the leaf and the sheath, which is the base part of the leaf blade that encloses the stem of a grass weed or a grass of any type. We're also going to look at roots, auricles, and ligules. So looking at the sheath, that base of the leaf that's wrapping the stem, it can either be split, there can be an overlap of the edges, or those edges can be fused together. With the ligule, it's present right where the leaf blade separates from the stem at the collar region, and it can be membranous, there can be a fringe of hairs, it could be completely lacking, or it may have some type of shape that will help us with identification. The auricles are like little arms coming from the edges of the leaf blade to sort of hug the grass stem, and they can be claw-like, rounded, they may be completely absent or just not fully developed, and again, a good differentiator. So there's a chart that we've developed that identifies all the different grassy weeds based on what their sheath, ligule, auricles, and life cycle is like, and let's just drill down into that a bit. So these are all crops that can be volunteers and therefore weeds. Something with large auricles is barley. Wheat has modest auricles, while oat has no auricle at all. When it comes to grassy weed identification, you need to get up close and personal. So a photo like this doesn't help me to see what grassy weed I might be looking at, but if we zoom in a bit closer, it's very easy to see that there is no auricle, but the easier thing to do is dig that weed up and notice that there's a brown seed there. It's fairly long, very, very much a wild oat. And just in case, let's drill down into that a little bit closer. The wild oat doesn't have anything for auricles, and it does have some hairs along the leaf margin. Again, like I said, the easiest thing here is to dig up that wild oat. It's free weed control, and you can see the seed attached. Same for wheat, same for barley. They all are very easy to dig up and notice which seed is at the end. As mentioned, this is wild oat. There are some other grassy weeds that are smaller and also challenging to differentiate. Yellow foxtail, green foxtail, and barnyard grass come to mind. This in particular is barnyard grass. It does have a flat stem, a little bit of red on the stem, although yellow foxtail can look very similar at this stage. But the key identifier here is that there is absolutely no auricle and no ligule present. So that indicates barnyard grass. Whereas when it's this stage, really challenging to tell whether it's any of those things, and digging it up and looking for a full seed head will help you out a bit. Now, to differentiate between the two foxtails, green foxtail and yellow foxtail does have a larger seed. That is the seed head on the right in the top picture. But you can also tell by the plant, at least by the 4th or 5th leaf stage, when you can pull apart and see the ligule, and it is a fringe of hairs for both of them. On the left is a green foxtail ligule, and as you can see, just a nice fringe of hairs. On the right, at the base of the leaf blade, you can see that yellow foxtail has long hairs on it, in addition to the ligule, which is still a fringe of hairs. So that is a differentiator between green foxtail and yellow foxtail. When we look at them at this stage, it is important to just be destructive, rip them apart. On the left is actually a picture of green foxtail, and on the right is a picture of barnyard grass. It would be really, really challenging just by looking at them to tell that difference. But when you rip them apart and look for the ligule, look to see if there's an auricle, those types of things, you get to figure out which is which. Now, I mentioned that some of the grassy weeds will have specialized stem, particularly true of perennial grasses. And in this case, we're looking at rhizomes, which are underground stems, versus stolons, which are above ground stems. And this is one of those particular perennial grasses. Very hard to tell, looks like any grass here, but when you dig it up and it's in a patch in the field, you can see that it's got a nice long rhizome, and if you look at the grass itself, with these smaller or modest auricles, we're looking at a quackgrass plant. It also has a spike for a seed head, but typically in spring we wouldn't see that yet. The other perennial weed that we see, or grassy weed that we see quite frequently in the spring, is this small, fine-looking grass that develops into quite a clump and has a fibrous root system underneath. No spreading rhizomes, no spreading roots, just a clump of roots. And this is actually foxtail barley. As it develops, we'll start to see that it's a bluey green color. It does have hair all over. It doesn't really seem to have much for an auricle, and later on that seed head is very distinguishing. The other fuzzy ones would be the Japanese and downy bromes. They are very challenging to tell apart. Again, lack of auricle. They do have a V where the sheath is approaching the collar, and so there are some differences from, say, foxtail barley, but very challenging to differentiate between downy brome and Japanese brome. There is a ligule with downy brome and Japanese brome. It is membranous, which is similar to foxtail barley, but like I said, the foxtail barley sheath is overlapping, whereas downy and Japanese brome have that V neck. Again, here's a summary of that chart of all the different grassy weeds that could come in handy when you're doing identification. Now, taking a picture like this, again, as I said, very challenging, hard to know. I know it's quackgrass because of digging it up later, but you do need to look at where that collar is. If the nodes are swollen, that can also be a differentiator. If there's a V for the leaf sheath, what type of a ligule it has, if there is an absence of ligule. So these are some better grass shots for helping with weed identification of grassy weeds. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and look at broadleaf weed identification. So broadleaf weeds, dicots, two cotyledons, and then true leaves, which can either be alternate, opposite, or whorled, or they can start off forming a rosette. So alternate, 1 leaf per node, opposite, 2 leaves per node, whorled, you're looking at 4 to 6 leaves per node, and a rosette, just a bunch of leaves with no internodal elongation, so really challenging to know whether it's alternate or opposite at that point. The roots can also help us out, and the growth habit, as I mentioned earlier in the video. So roots, you can have a taproot, you can have a fibrous root system, there could be a bulb, a corm, a tuber, all sorts of things that can help us in identifying broadleaf weeds. The true leaves, as I mentioned, opposite, 2 leaves per node, whorled, having 3 or more leaves arranged around a node, leaves that are alternate, 1 per node, or that basal rosette, like a dandelion, for instance. Now, true leaves can be simple, so 1 leaf, or it can be pinnately compound, where we have leaflets on either side of the petiole, or palmately compound, where it's sort of like the palm of your hand with the leaflets coming out from a central point. Leaf margins can be entire. They can be serrated like a bread knife, so sort of toothed, or lobed, which is more rounded. And the one for me that's differentiating here, serrated would be biennial wormwood, lobed would be common ragweed. Just a difference there between how the leaf is shaped. Leaf attachments, you can have a petiolate leaf where there is a stem between, or a petiole between the stem and the leaf. Sessile, where the leaf is directly attached to the stem, or clasping, where it's hugging the stem. There are many leaf shapes. It's good to be familiar with the terms, especially if you're trying to key out a weed and not just look at it and instantly visualize which one it is. So here are some terms that may help you in the future. Another part of the leaf that does help with identification would be the apex, or the point of the leaf, and there's a bunch of different terms for describing that as well. I'm not going to go into them, but certainly something that can help you with differentiation. So here's a key that we're just going to use as an example, looking at the first and second leaves and whether the margins are toothed or deeply divided, what the shape of that leaf is, and then looking at the third, fourth, and fifth leaves as well. And it all started from that top left corner. You can see that it had an orbicular cotyledon and then keyed out from there. This is from the Identification Guide to the Weeds of Quebec. I find this key to be really helpful, especially with some of the seedlings. There's some great pictures in this guide as well, so I use it quite frequently. All right, let's deep dive into some of those weeds so that we have an idea of what we're looking at. So the mustard family often forms that rosette. It has alternate leaves when you do see some stem elongation, and the flowers will have 4 petals and 4 sepals. When it comes to the mustard family and some early weeds that you would see, stinkweed and shepherd's purse are the two that you see most early on. At this stage, at the cotyledon stage, really challenging to tell those two apart. At this stage, here's the 2 weeds in the same pattern, but just later on in life when they've formed rosettes. And this is what you would see early on in spring. So stinkweed on the left, shepherd's purse on the right. Stinkweed has no hairs on it, whereas shepherd's purse does have hairs, and you don't see much lobing on the stinkweed, whereas you do start to see significant lobing in the shepherd's purse leaves. If we look closer at shepherd's purse, there is hairs on the leaves, as I mentioned, and those hairs, when you get into a more mature plant, form little star-looking shapes. So 5 hairs sort of coming out at one point, arranged into a bit of a star. The other thing about stinkweed is that it tends to have a smell, whereas shepherd's purse doesn't have a smell. Now, some people like the smell of stinkweed and others do not like it. And finally, the seed pods on both of them are quite different. So stinkweed, more of a round seed pod, shepherd's purse with a little heart-shaped seed pod. Another mustard family plant or plants, which are difficult to tell apart, would be wild mustard and volunteer canola. And looking at the cotyledons, they're very similar, makes it challenging to identify at this particular stage. If we wait a little bit longer, typically you will find that you'll have more hairs on a wild mustard than you will on a volunteer canola. And also wild mustard tends to be a little bit more of a green color versus volunteer canola, which tends to be more of a blue color. So wild mustard, as seen here, lots of hairs once you get into the true leaves, and typically at this stage there's not a lot of feeding on it. Whereas if we look at volunteer canola, well, these are perfect examples of volunteer canola. Out in a field, typically what you will see is that these will be feasted on by flea beetles because it's not protected by a seed treatment, whereas your seeded canola will definitely have more protection. Again, sort of a kidney-shaped cotyledon, and then the true leaves come out, much less hairy on volunteer canola than it is with wild mustard. this might be something more likely that you'll see in the field, especially if it's been cold in the spring, there's been a bit of frost. So those perfect looking plants aren't always there. Instead, you would see something like this. And this is, again, volunteer canola. Another brassica family would be flaxweed. It has sort of spatula-shaped cotyledons. The first true leaves are really interesting. They're the only ones that are three-lobed. And then after that, flaxweed becomes more of a pinnately divided leaf, very finely divided, a gray-green color most of the time, but that does depend on growing conditions. It does form a basal rosette before it elongates. Flipping over to the composite family, where we see a lot of the different weeds within the agriculture setting: dandelion, Canada thistle, perennial sow thistle, annual sow thistle. All of those types of weeds are in the composite family. And there's two different subfamilies of the composite family. So the tubuliflorae, which is watery sap, and that includes burdock, the knapweeds, the thistles, and scentless chamomile. And then liguliflorae with the milky sap, and that's the sow thistles, dandelion, narrow-leaved hawksbeard, and those types of plants. Again, if we go back to this key, what we're going to notice is that a lot of them have an orbicular or round cotyledon, and then the first and second leaves, there isn't a lot of differentiation. If you look at perennial sow thistle, smooth perennial sow thistle, annual sow thistle, spiny annual sow thistle, prickly lettuce, and dandelion in the light blue on that chart, there is very little differentiation based on a key, and we have to look at sort of some of the visual differences. So this key is from the Identification Guide to the Weeds of Quebec. It also has some great pictures of seedlings in it. It's a cheaper type of resource, about $20 to purchase, and I find it really valuable. All right, so Canada thistle. Of course, it has round cotyledons. We just mentioned that, and that can be something that you can use to identify it, especially once the first true leaves come out and they're a little bit hairy and there's quite defined prickles on the ends of each of the serrations on the leaf. But more often than not, Canada thistle comes out already as a rosette because it's coming up from that underground root structure that's so well developed. And so it's typically in patches, and it's just easier to scout based on that identifier than it is to look at the cotyledons. Perennial sow thistle, again, we've got these round cotyledons to start with. If it is from seed, which you would see more perennial sow thistle as a seedling than you would say Canada thistle. But again, typically what you're going to find with perennial sow thistle is that it's generated from underground roots, and that you're going to have clumps of it. Perennial sow thistle is not as prickly as Canada thistle, but it still does generate in patches for the most part. Annual sow thistle, again, round cotyledons, and then that first true leaf comes out, it's got a few hairs on it, and it's just a very distinctive shape. The thing about annual sow thistle is it's not typically there first thing in the spring. So unlikely that you're going to see annual sow thistle in April or even early May. It's a little bit of a later germinating one. Sow thistle, as it gets more mature, will develop a taproot if it's annual sow thistle versus perennial sow thistle, which has that creeping root system. And then you can see deep lobing on the annual sow thistle leaves on that right hand picture. Spiny annual sow thistle, the main identifier between it and annual sow thistle is those significant spines on the tips of each of those lobes on the leaf, okay? It's very aggressive with the spines, and we are seeing an increasing amount of spiny annual sow thistle in Manitoba. We also have dandelion. Now, again, round cotyledons, not much for spines, fairly fleshy type of a vein, and so it can be hard to distinguish from others. What we do normally see is that it is coming from a taproot. It's probably a winter annual, and you end up with a rosette very early on. And then the key identifier of dandelion is that unlike all the sow thistles, which can have leaves on the flower stem, you are going to see a hollow stem come up from that basal rosette, and then, you know, a normal yellow bloom, a single stalk for each flower with a dandelion. There's no other of the sow thistles that looks like dandelion when it comes to that blooming. Prickly lettuce is another one that we're seeing more of, and the differentiator there is it'll look like sow thistle, annual sow thistle for sure when it's early on, but if it's a little bit of an older plant and you flip it over on the underside of the mid vein on the leaf, you will see all those little prickles, and that is a telltale sign of prickly lettuce. Keeping going, biennial wormwood. Again, round cotyledons. Oh, the frustration. But when we get to the first true leaves in biennial wormwood, there is a little bit of indentation, and as we develop that biennial wormwood, it grows a bit more, we start to see serrated leaves, very finely divided, and it becomes much easier to differentiate. Biennial wormwood, like I mentioned earlier, can be confused with common ragweed, but the lobing on common ragweed is much more rounded versus biennial wormwood that is serrated. And so that would be a differentiator there, but this is very telltale look of biennial wormwood, that left hand picture. Narrow-leaved hawksbeard, there are patches of it in Manitoba. I wouldn't say it is the most prevalent weed, but certainly it can look like a dandelion, or it can have a much smoother leaf. Lots of variation in that. It is a basal rosette as well, but as it gets larger, you can see that it differentiates from a dandelion because, again, you have leaves on the flower stalks, you've got clusters, and it doesn't develop a leaf like a sow thistle leaf. It is its own sort of linear leaf on that flower stalk, which will make it look quite different from any of the other sow thistles or anything else in that part of the composite family. Canada fleabane is one that we see a bit in Manitoba, but it hasn't become a real problem like it is in Ontario. And I'm a bit surprised by that, so I'm kind of on the lookout for it. Now, Canada fleabane can overwinter as a winter annual, and that left-hand picture is a zoomed-in look at an overwintering rosette. The leaves are very hairy, they have some distinctive notching to them, and this is what you would see in the spring rather than cotyledons. The picture on the right is as it's starting to elongate, it starts to lose that hairiness on the leaves turn a darker green, but there is still some notching on that leaf that has become much more elongated, and it just looks quite a bit different from the seedling. So the seedling on the left is the one to focus on. That's what you would see in the spring. Very, very hairy and a very distinct leaf shape there. Okay, Cleavers, the Mallow family. So they have a square stem, and I tried to provide a couple of pictures that show that. So the more mature plants, the two bottom pictures, you can start to see that there's a square stem. You can also see that there's whorled leaves, and you're probably looking at 6 leaves at that whorl. The other thing, though, when you're looking at it in the spring, is the cotyledons are fairly long, oval with a notch in the end, and then you can start to see a whorl develop really quickly. So as soon as you get into the first true leaf or first whorl, very easy to tell that it's a cleaver. Volunteer flax, on the other hand, the two cotyledons don't have a notch in the end of them, as you can see at the bottom of the left-hand picture. And then it does start out with opposite leaves, and then eventually, as you see in the right-hand picture, it goes to alternate leaves. So it's a little bit unusual about that. Now, volunteer flax also differentiates from cleavers in that it's a round stem instead of a square stem. The goosefoot family is very prevalent in the spring. Goosefoot shaped leaves, it may accumulate salts, may or may not have a reddish color, and non-petaled flowers. Those are the features of the goosefoot family in general. And the goosefoot weed that's prevalent in the spring is usually Lambsquarters. Now, the thing that differentiates Lambsquarters from others in the goosefoot family would be the farrinose or fairy dust, whatever you want to call it, that mealy substance that glistens in the sort of leaf base of each of the sets of opposite leaves. The cotyledons on Lambsquarters, they're fairly long, relatively nondescript. It's once you get into the true leaves that you start to see some of that meal that helps to identify the Lambsquarters. Also, it's opposite leaves on Lambsquarters. This is kochia. It looks more of a rosette type of style and very hard to tell whether it's opposite leaves or whatever. Also in the goosefoot family, definitely tolerates the salinity, as we all know, and very, very hairy as a seedling. So that left-hand top picture is what you would see in the spring, just like those previous pictures. So usually fairly distinctive, unlike almost anything else. The pink family is opposite leaves. There's a round stem and 5 petals and 5 sepals. Now, some of the weeds that are problematic within the pink family would be night flowering catchfly and white cockle. And they can look very much the same. They both have opposite leaves. The leaves are hairy. The difference between night flowering catchfly and white cockle that's easiest is that it's sticky. Unfortunately, for night flowering catchfly identification, that stickiness is usually concentrated on the actual buds, and so very late before you start to be able to identify by the stickiness. Now, a night flowering catchfly would be an annual or a winter annual typically. White cockle tends to be more of a biennial or a perennial. And if we look at the actual cotyledons, we can see that they're fairly round, almost a spatula shape, and then there are some hairs on the first true leaves along the leaf margin. And then if you look at the bud, that is the flower bud that's shown in the bottom picture on this slide, you can see that there's a fly trapped on that bud because it is sticky at that point in time. But that's a fairly mature stage and not something we want to rely on when we're identifying this. White cockle, on the other hand, there is less of a stalk to the cotyledon, or less of a petiole on the cotyledon. It is a less round looking leaf as well, although really hard unless you have them side by side to tell. Typically white cockle, you will see some more mature plants in the area. It tends to be a little bit further ahead in the spring than night flowering catchfly, and it isn't sticky at all. Now, most of the control options for white cockle work with night flowering catchfly as well, so differentiation isn't necessarily that important, but they are different and there are some differences on some of the labels, so it is good to know. The other one in the pink family that is not hairy really would be chickweed, and it has relatively round cotyledons and then these little mouse ear shaped leaves, and then there's a picture that shows what looks like 10 petals, but it's actually just 5 petals on the flowers. They're just really deeply lobed or deeply divided, and so it ends up looking like 10 petals. But chickweed is something that grows fairly prostrate most of the time, opposite leaves, like I said, and a fun little shape, sort of round with a point at the apex. The buckwheat family, which includes wild buckwheat and smartweed, one of the key characteristics of this family is the ochrea. Now, the cotyledons are usually at 120 degrees, but depending on how things germinate, that doesn't always work out perfectly. They do have small flowers. There are sepals, but no petals on those flowers. But again, if we look at wild buckwheat, the key identifier to it is really its leaf shape. And so I gave you several pictures of leaves. It can be green, it can be a little bit red. It certainly is an arrow shape with some shoulders on it for that leaf shape. That is the identifier. It is a climbing growth habit, and it will wind its way up plants. So that does cause some issues. It's also very challenging to control this one with glyphosate once it's beyond 3 or 4 or 5 leaf. So really challenging to control early in the spring with just glyphosate. You need to make some good decisions on herbicide controls with it. On the right is smartweed. You can see that some of those cotyledons aren't at the 120 degrees, so it breaking that rule. But smartweed, you will see that first leaf come out and it's fairly large, and then the second leaf starts to come out afterwards, and you will see hairs on the smartweed leaves. Can be on the upside or on the top side, but also on the underside. So hairs on the smartweed, and it will also have an ochrea. The mint family, again back to square stems, but different from the whorl of leaves with cleavers and the madder family. These are opposite leaves, and two of the ones that we see a lot in the mint family would be hemp nettle. Now if we look at the hemp nettle cotyledons, they're very round, like very round, a little bit of a shoulder to them where they attach to the stem or to the petiole, which attaches to the stem. And then you can also see a dent in the end of it. So it's not perfectly round because there's a little dent at the end. And then once you get that pair of true leaves coming out, very, very key identifier. There are hairs on those true leaves, and it just looks like hemp nettle. There's nothing else that looks like it once you know what it looks like. American dragonhead, the cotyledons are fairly similar, but you can see that the true leaves are they have a longer petiole, it's a rounder leaf, and a different tooth to the edge of that leaf. Roundleaf mallow, heart-shaped cotyledons. That is the number one identifier for roundleaf mallow. You can also see that there's sort of that kidney-shaped leaf, lots of crinkles to the outside of it, and it does have a very palmate vein pattern to it. Stork's bill, another one with a very distinctive cotyledon. It's three-lobed and nothing else really looks like that. You can notice that the petioles are very, very hairy, which is also an identifier, and it forms a basal rosette. Now it's in the Geranium family, and we do see a fair bit of stork's bill in Manitoba. Broadleaf plantain, the plantain family is unique in that it's one of the ones that has almost a parallel vein pattern. It does form a basal rosette. It can emerge from seed, so you can see the cotyledons as you see in the left. They're relatively nondescript, and then it has these broader leaves, but typically in the spring it acts as a perennial, and so you do see these rosettes already formed. They're usually more dinged up than this beautiful rosette that I'm showing you here, but that parallel leaf vein is very distinctive. You don't see it in many others. And if you actually pull apart the leaf, those veins are like fibers within that plant, and you can see that when you pull the leaf apart. The amaranth family is one that has been really key for me for a while, the last year or so, because of water hemp. We also hear about Palmer amaranth in the south being an issue. Those are threats to Manitoba, but Redroot pigweed is the one that we see the most. Now, they are stalked alternate leaves. They're primarily annuals. They have small, very boring flowers, but it is very challenging to key out these particular weeds. So if you're looking at them in a key, then there's very minor differences between them. So I'm going to just show you the difference between Redroot pigweed, which is this one, and I'm going to also show you Waterhemp, because those are the two that we see most frequently in Manitoba that get confused. There's also a couple of other pigweeds, but these are the two that we see having the most economic importance. So the Redroot pigweed, it is longer, lance almost shaped cotyledon, rounded at the end, and then oval to ovate leaves, and they will be hairy. The cotyledons on Waterhemp, which is on the right, versus the cotyledons of Redroot pigweed are different. There's almost shoulders on the Waterhemp one, and then it's very tapered to a point. You can also see that it's almost like fuzz on the Redroot pigweed, whereas the Waterhemp is a smooth cotyledon and leaf. If we look a little bit later on, here's Redroot pigweed on the left, Waterhemp on the right as seedlings. You can definitely see the fuzz on the Redroot pigweed versus no hairs on the Waterhemp. And then just for information, later on the Waterhemp will continue to be hairless, as that bottom right picture shows you, and a more narrow leaf typically than Redroot pigweed. Like I said, completely hairless, but it can be red or it can be green. So like I said, Redroot pigweed on the left, Waterhemp on the right. There's some keys, identifiers to some of the common seedlings that you might see in Manitoba. Tune in to part 2, where you get a chance to take some of these identifying features and take a quiz on 30 common weeds in Manitoba.